Ladies and gentlemen, friends, welcome to the book launch of Beyond the Blue Gate. This book launch is presented by Function 8, and this is an initiative by a group of us who want to facilitate the sharing of experiences of those who are socially aware, and we want to encourage discussions on the future of our country. Some of us were active in various organizations and have been hibernating socially. So we choose to name this initiative Function 8 because just like in the keyboard for computers, the Function 8 key means to start again in safe mode. For us, we hope we can also start again in safe mode, but it's more like rebooting our systems and starting from much needed basics for democracy in Singapore by stimulating discussions and bringing awareness. Now, the proceeds from the sale of this book will be used to support other programs that Function 8 is planning. So we look forward to your support. Now I would like to introduce our first speaker, Alfian Sa'at. He's resident playwright with Wild Rice and associate artist with Theatre Ekamatra, a Malay language theatre company. Alfian is an accomplished poet who has published 2 collections of poetry, One Fierce Hour and A History of Amnesia. He's also published a collection of short stories, Corridor. The award-winning Young Artist for Literature and Playwright has his plays translated into German and Swedish, and some of these plays have been performed in Zurich, Hamburg, Berlin, and Stockholm. We now invite Alfian to say a few words. Thank you.
Hello, hi. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for the pleasure of your company this afternoon. I think I will start with a little anecdote. I'm a playwright, and in the year 2005, I did a play with a theatre company, Theatre Ekamatra. Okay, I hope not to get too long-winded about this, but I was doing research basically because one day someone handed me a booklet, and the title of that booklet was Why the ISA? Yeah. So there was this English version, but someone handed me the multilingual version. So it had the Malay title of it was called Mengapa ISA? Mengapa is why. And I was very intrigued by this booklet because obviously it was printed to legitimize the ISA in the wake of the JI arrests. Yeah. And what was interesting for me, I looked at it and it had a potential for mischief because ISA in Malay spells Isa, which is the Quranic name for Jesus. So I was looking at it and it says why Mengapa Isa, which is also why Jesus, and made it look like an evangelical pamphlet, which I suppose is propaganda, evangelism, close cousins. So anyway, I was browsing through it, and what struck me was that there was no mention at all of 1987's Operation Spectrum. So in an attempt to legitimize and justify this draconian law, it seems as if there was this very striking omission. It seemed as if there was something that still needed to be hidden, and of course, it gave rise to a lot of questions. I mean, what are they hiding if really there was all this anxiety to justify it during that time? And an entire parliament almost chorusing in unison in support of what happened in 1987. Why then, sort of gloss over that very important piece of history? And it's an informative book because it talks about stuff like some terrorist activity, some Laju ferry, whatever, a lot of cloak and daggers, espionage kind of stuff. But there was zero mention of both 1987 as well as how the ISA was used in 1963. And of course that's a mystery to me. If you had conducted this particular Operation Spectrum that year, why are you not sort of proud of it? Why are you not wearing it as a certain badge of honor? It is part of the history of the ISD. And it made me think about, and I'm gonna make, I suppose, quite a general statement here. And I've always believed that all politicians lie. Uh, it is in the nature of being a politician. I'm not saying that all politicians are liars, but they do lie. Because it is in the nature of politics, it is the nature of power. Some lies are whiter than others, you know. But you know, for most part, they lie. And how do they lie? By narrowing alternatives into ultimatums, for example. You know, we either go this way or that way, and by not actually looking at other kinds of alternatives, by omissions, as I have observed in that Why the I Say booklet, by also taking undue credit. For example, we were the ones who came up with these particular ideas. Sort of a civil society had no part. For example, in coming up with some of these initiatives, everything is so centralized and everything came from the top because we have the best gene pool. So I have to qualify that. I'm not saying it's all politicians are liars. I seem to be covering my backside a lot, but I'm saying that there are all these instances of lying, which is part and parcel of being a politician, because the edifice of power, however monumental it looks, is also very fragile, because every day you have to paper over it with these little lies. And I think what's very interesting for me is living in Singapore, this idea of Operation Spectrum or the Marxist conspiracy has been one huge lie. And I say that because of the absence of any credible evidence that can be used to convince the population that this was something that was completely essential to maintain the security of this country. So, what does Operation Spectrum mean to me, and I think specifically members of my generation? I think it represents this kind of a little black hole in our history. We don't have all the answers as to why it happened, and also a kind of open wound for me as well, because there has not been any admission of error on the part of the authorities. That once in a while you hear statements like, oh, actually the people who were arrested, they weren't really troublemakers, they were idealists or they were do-gooders. But it begs the question then, why were do-gooders being punished? What kind of a society do you live in if you punish people whose only aim was to do good? Yeah, and I think it all boils down to this question of moral legitimacy, and I think that is the question I'm always struggling with. What does it mean to be a ruler? What does it mean to be a leader of a people? We look at the legitimacy of the government in Singapore based on what they can deliver in economic terms. So if they can give us a certain continued GDP growth or economic prosperity, etc., then they are apparently a good government. But I don't think this is just the standard that we should hold them up to. I think as a leader, what you should also be able to demonstrate is a certain kind of, I will come back to this phrase over and over again, moral legitimacy. I don't necessarily expect the state to be the conscience of a country, but it has to act in ways which are ethical. And I think 1987 for me represented a certain kind of betrayal of those kinds of expectations. So when I talk about moral legitimacy, it becomes a little clearer to me why a lot of the people who were persecuted were actually people who were engaged in, for example, social work, engaged in ideas of social transformation, even if this was, let's say, through the realm of ideas. Let's say if you're an artist, people have said, oh, the artists are actually the conscience of a society because they raise the difficult questions, and they ask all these hard questions about, okay, which direction are we going, etc. So there seemed to be that sense for me of how the state saw this as a kind of threat to their own legitimacy, because they could not claim a certain moral legitimacy for themselves, and therefore they could not allow other sectors of the population to act as this particular conscience of society. And it's always very disillusioning for me to see how this idea of moral legitimacy has been sort of corrupted over time, how it has been streamlined and defined and circumscribed in a very narrow manner. And by that I mean, okay, we have moral legitimacy because we are not corrupt, for example, because we do not take bribes. But I think there are definitely other, much larger dimensions of those things that involve issues like what are the rights of citizens, what kinds of freedoms do we have, what is the meaning of social justice, for example, which are all moral and ethical issues as well. So, reading Soh Lung's book, I found it to be a very harrowing experience. Yes, because I see that book as a kind of counter-testimony to the kinds of things that were printed and published during that time in '87. I don't know whether, some of you have done your research, but if you look at the Hansard transcripts, which are basically parliamentary transcripts in '87, it was so frightening to see how so many of the MPs were basically echoing one another. And I think for me, it made me all the more convinced that we need some kind of political pluralism. I mean, it's not just about checks or balances or whatever, but basically, the more people you have who are potentially on, say, opposing sides, the closer I think you get to a sense of the truth. When you have an almost a near monopoly of parliament, I think it's much easier to lie, and as I've said, politicians lie all the time. So I see Soh Lung's book as this lone voice, but I hope there'll be more in the future that acts as a counter to the kinds of propaganda that was actually manufactured during that time and are still being manufactured today, with phrases like these people are dangerous because they are part of a united communist front, for example. I mean, what does that mean? And so much of it is rhetorical, and there's so much that we really need to start unpacking, and not take these things for granted. And I think that's also the other issue about one of the effects of this so-called Marxist conspiracy. I'll just list down a few. I think it had very far-reaching consequences on civil society, for example. The nightmare scenario of actually having people visit you at night, knocking on your door, barging in and arresting you was materialized. Yeah. So it definitely had a chilling effect. Okay, you want to do good, but please, do it through the proper channels. So, civil society was one casualty, I feel. It had effects on the social dimensions of religious activity. Yeah, and I won't go too much into it, but it's always made me a little sad that, when I used to think of people who were involved with religious organizations as involved in altruistic ideals like welfare for the poor, etc. And these days it's just sort of that connection between capital and religion is becoming quite scary. It seems as if it's more about self-enrichment than anything else. And obviously, I come from an artistic background, so this particular incident did have a very, very chilling effect on artistic expression in Singapore. I mean, that idea, that myth, was being played out. Our worst fears, the knock on the door, middle of the night, no recourse to the law, because in a sense, the Internal Security Act transcends the law. Yeah. So. These are all the effects, but I think on a more general note, it was also about this kind of epicenter where I think the aftershocks is this sense of fear that gripped everyone. And when I say fear, there are many dimensions to it. One, which is basically the fear of taking initiative. One a permission-seeking behavior. I mean, a lot of us don't start acting, on our consciences unless we have some kind of permission from somewhere. So, there are many mechanisms in place, like, for example, Registration Societies Act, etc. So it's so difficult, I think, for members of civil society to translate their knowledge into action precisely because of this permission-seeking behavior. And an automatic trust in authority, I think, is also one of the ill effects of this, that we trust so much people who are in power. We believe that they know what is actually best for us. Yeah, and I think in other societies, if, let's say, someone says, oh, we need that so-called, that law, that move on order, because we trust that our policemen will not abuse their powers. But I don't believe this at all for a moment. I think we should always be skeptical of those who have more power than us. I think it's a very, very natural instinct. A small dog will look at a big dog and, okay, I don't think I trust you because you are bigger than me. You can harm me. You have that power to commit some kind of violence against me. And lastly, it's this instant assumption of guilt, I think, which is a product of living in this regime, in a certain climate of fear. So when someone in uniform approaches you, almost immediately you're like, okay, what did I do wrong, right? That becomes almost reflexive, instead of what does this guy want, or what is going on. One of the first things is this an almost automatic self-recrimination. Oh, what did I do wrong, and how can I start to prove my innocence? So for me, looking at 1987, I don't think as a society we can actually move forward unless we come to terms with what's happened. Yeah, of course, ideally there should be some kind of a truth and reconciliation committee that's being set up to actually examine what actually happened. Where were the directives taken from? Why were people behaving in a certain manner? And I have to say personally, I feel very invested in this particular moment in our history, because I think about Whitley Detention Center, and I think about, in a sense, the two kinds of people who are there, the detainees as well as the officers. The detainees who were subjected to various forms of not just incarceration but even violence, and of course the officers who committed these acts of violence. And the thing about let's say the histories of certain countries like Nazi Germany or Japan is that they have had this sort of stained past, but a way to heal is to come to terms with that past. So for example, in Germany, you are being taught about, let's say, the Holocaust as early as, let's say, primary school. So you know this, and you're aware and you're conscientized, and you ask yourself, do I have that capacity for evil in me? And can I always remind myself never again? Japan is a little bit more complicated because there is this kind of distancing that, that was a product of a particular era, of a particular kind of propaganda machine that was operating, the cult of the emperor, etc. And those people are different from us. When I think of what happened in Whitley Detention Center in '87, I feel that I am both the detainee as well as the officer. As a human being, I think all of us, we carry that capacity for violence in us. We carry that capacity for, that there is a certain darkness that I think all of us are capable of. But on the other hand, on the part of the detainees, I think we are also capable of remarkable courage. We are capable of doing things like, one of the things that really affected me reading Soh Lung's book is how she would mention at times she would try to empathize with her case officers. She would try to see them as these human beings with jobs and families, and she did even try to think about cooperating just so that they would not risk their jobs, and she did try to rationalize it as a kind of Stockholm syndrome, this kind of sympathy for your kidnappers. And I think it was very clear to me that it was an asymmetrical relationship, of course, that you have these detainees who exhibited much greater humanity than their captors, who obviously saw them as, I don't know, either scapegoats or these vessels through which you are supposed to break and extract confessions from. So that for me was a very harrowing moment in the book, when you obviously have this asymmetrical relationship, one party trying to humanize the other, and the other party completely trying to dehumanize the other. Because how can you beat someone up unless you see the person as less than human, unless you see the person as not consisting of your own anatomy, of the very nerves that can cause you pain. So when I look at this, I realize that this is a society that has this kind of duality. We are both the captors as well as the detainees, insisting that the truth would have to come to light. There needs to be some kind of commission of inquiry into what happened, because otherwise this present government will not have any kind of moral legitimacy. And lastly, I will just talk about the title of this book. I think it's a beautiful title because it's called Beyond the Blue Gate. And as much as it's the idea of the beyond, you can see it from the perspective of someone who was within Whitley Detention Center and yearning for the freedoms outside. But I think from the perspective of some of us who have enjoyed free lives, it is also about being on the outside and looking in. So that there is that dual perspective, and we, as people who have not been through this incident and has not suffered, what then is our responsibility? How can we try to imagine what happened inside and tell ourselves that this should never happen again? How can we build our networks of solidarity and empathy for one another to ensure that this must never happen again? And I think the one of the ways to really guarantee, no matter how much they try to soft sell the Internal Security Act as a kind of new anti-terror legislation, a very useful tool, etc., the ISA really has to go if we wish to see ourselves closer to these people, to these courageous detainees. And if we believe in the idea of certain conscience in society, it's suddenly gone all disco for some reason. But yeah, so I don't see any other choice actually than to call for the abolishment of the Internal Security Act. And thank you. Thank you. Wow. And I think with that, I would like to hand over to Ms. Teo Soh Lung, who will share with you experiences of writing the book. Thank you very much.
A very good afternoon to all of you. Thank you so much for taking time to come here to attend this launch of my book. First of all, I would like to thank all my friends who have worked so hard to organize this event for me. They make it happen. Would you all like to give them a round of applause? Today I am actually very happy because at long last, the manuscript which I wrote some 20 years ago did not be kept a secret anymore. It is a relief for me because I no longer need to smile and keep a dumb look when friends and young people ask, hey, write about your experience. Now I can tell them, well, you can buy a book, help me to defray some costs, and know all about 1987. Let me tell you why and how this book was written. In a way, I was helped by the ISD. A bit of a surprise for all of you. You see, before I was released in 1990, I asked senior ISD officers if I could leave the country for a holiday. And they said, no problem, we'll give you permission to leave in the shortest possible time. So when I was released, I immediately applied for permission to leave Singapore for Australia. They hesitated and they said, look, you got to show us some proof that you are really going away. How should I do that? Well, you got to show us your ticket, So I actually applied for a visa and a return air ticket to go to Australia. And then they hesitated again, and finally they said, sorry, you cannot leave Singapore. So what could I do with the rejection? I had already planned my holiday to go to Australia, and my sister had sent me some money. I thought, well, I'll just make good use of that money. And I'll buy a computer and learn to use it so that when I restart my legal practice again, it will be a useful skill. So I asked my friends to help me buy a computer, and they did that. Not only that, they gave me some free lessons. In the 1990s, the computer is not such a simple gadget, It took me a bit of time to learn to use it. And I learned to use it, and then the idea that perhaps I should just record my experience, my prison experience, came about. So you see, I owe it to the ISD, this writing of this manuscript. In those days, I was quite disciplined. I spent several hours every day writing, and I wrote, and I wrote, and I read all the materials concerning the Marxist conspiracy, which I could not read when I was in prison. And finally, when all my writing was done, the chapters were very long because I just wrote whatever that came to my mind, I just wrote. Finally, when it was all done, I asked my good friend, the late Eileen Lau, to read it. She did, and she was one of two friends who read the manuscript. After that, I simply kept the manuscript away and never looked at it for several years. I tried to look at it some years ago, but I just could not read it. And then finally, young people, friends keep bugging me, how about writing your experience? And I thought, well, maybe it is time to put that manuscript into a book. And so one of the reasons why I retired several years ago was to write, or rather edit this book. But even then, when I came out, I was still doing nothing, Until one day, one of my friends said, hey, you've already retired. Why don't you just write about your experience in prison? I'll edit the work for you. I said, well, it's quite a good idea. And so I said, okay. So I took out my old manuscript and I started to work on it. And then I gave my friends by installments, And as she read, she said, hey, actually it's quite interesting. It is of publishable quality. I said, yeah, of publishable quality. Okay. I showed it to a few more friends, and they all agreed that, yes, it can be made into a book, and it would be good to set the record straight for posterity. So, that was one of the reasons why I started to make this book happen. Last year, one of my neighbors told me that my name was mentioned in The Man in White. He asked me if I could give him a lesson on Marxism. I told him I have not read Marx and wish I'm really a Marxist, as the government alleged that I was one. And he said, come on, you're a lousy Marxist. You don't even know anything about Marx. So, I decided to check out this book, Man in White, and actually I wanted to borrow it from the library. But before I could do that, my good sister-in-law bought a copy for me as a Christmas present. And so, I flipped the index and I found my name, and then I looked at the chapter, and wow, my name was mentioned together with several of my friends, and I read it. And, the authors did not interview me for the book or my co-conspirators. I think they did not even read materials pertaining to the episode. One glaring error is found at page 437 about my appearance and that of Tang Fong Ha and Francis Xiao before the Select Committee hearing on the Legal Profession Amendment Bill. I quote the paragraph. Both Teo and Tang, together with Xiao and several other witnesses, appeared in the Select Committee hearing at the Parliament House Annex in October before a panel chaired by the Speaker of Parliament, Yeoh Ghim Seng. They faced relentless questioning by Lee, Law Minister E.W. Barker, and Jaya Kumar. The proceedings, held over 2 days, were televised. At the end of the hearing, all were agreed that the Law Society should keep out of politics. If the authors had bothered to look at the official report of the Select Committee, they would have discovered that the relentless questioning of the three of us was by the Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew alone. Now, sometime in 2007, Senior Minister Lee Kuan Yew advised his MPs on the writings of memoirs. He said, "When writing memoirs, you are talking to posterity. Among them will be historians who will check what you write against the accounts of others. Do not shade the past." My book is my account of what happened in 1987 and what I did before that. I leave you to form your own conclusion as to who is telling the truth, the man in white or I. The alleged Marxist conspiracy, which saw the arrest and imprisonment without trial of 24 people in 1987 and 1988, have caused tremendous hardship and misery to many. Some of those arrested were young polytechnic students, 16, 17-year-olds. Imagine the trauma that they had to face at that time when they were arrested. Today, 6 of the 24 have left Singapore, and several friends who were accused of instigating us are now living abroad. Many of us still suffer the trauma of arrest and imprisonment. And like rape victims, some still cannot speak about their experiences to their families. They would rather be left alone and not be reminded of the episode. As a victim of the ISA, and many in this audience are also victims, indeed, victims who have suffered much more than me, I call for the ISA to be abolished. The ISA and its predecessors, the Preservation of Public Security Ordinance and the emergency regulations, have destroyed and damaged many lives from British colonial days till today. We do not know how many have suffered under the ISA, but it would not be wrong to estimate the figure as several thousands. To imprison a person without trial for an indefinite period of time is cruel and inhuman. Singapore, as a rich first world nation, cannot tolerate such a law. As early as 1955, Lee Kuan Yew, in arguing against the passage of the Preservation of Public Security Ordinance, said eloquently in the Legislative Assembly, and I quote, "If it is not totalitarian to arrest a man and detain him when you cannot charge him with any offense against any written law, if that is not what we have always cried out against the fascist states, then what is it?" This can be found in Hansard, September 1955, column 7 to 6. Further in his speech, he said, "I believe that for 7 years now, we have developed an emergency mentality. Many people believe that the only way to keep down any form of agitation, which anybody may have exploited for their own personal or political ends, is by the use of repressive laws, more policemen and more arrests. But this has proved false after 7 years. I hate to think that after another 3 or 4 years, or whenever it may be when the Chief Minister decides to go back to the people, that it is again to be proved false. It is such a futile answer to the communist challenge. If we are to survive as a free democracy, then we must be prepared, in principle, to concede to our enemies, even those who do not subscribe to our views, as much constitutional right as you concede yourself. My plea, to quote from someone in another context, is that the time has come in Malaya for an agonizing reappraisal of strategy and strength. To go blindly in the hope that somehow or the other, suppression can prevent latent social, economic, and political discontents from manifesting themselves and disrupting the structure of society is a piece of folly to which my party does not subscribe. It is my sincere hope that the senior minister will today reflect on what he said and believed in 1955. More repressive laws, more policemen, and more arrests can never prevent latent social, economic, and political discontents from manifesting themselves and disrupting the structure of society. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm reading several messages from well-wishers and people who have sent the message through the emails. Okay, the first one here I've got is from Kevin D'Souza, who is now in Perth, Australia, and he is a fellow detainee of the 1987 arrests. Okay, here in cold wintry Perth, I'm looking forward to reading Teo Soh Lung's recollections. Beyond the Blue Gate. Knowing the dynamic and spirited character of Soh Lung, I am certain it would make honest and compelling reading of her time in detention. But more than that, Soh Lung's book has significant importance in the political context of Singapore, where for too long, sensitive matters such as ISA arrests and detentions were only discussed behind closed doors. Okay, yeah, sorry. I congratulate Soh Lung in taking the bold and courageous step of exposing the truth of her arrest and detention while continuing to remain in Singapore under the surveillance of the PAP security apparatus. Soh Lung's book follows a trend of recent publications by former political prisoners in Singapore in exploding the lies and myths behind their detention, propagated by the PAP government and the local press. It will add to the ongoing debate on the legitimacy of the ISA and its place in a democracy. It will challenge each and every Singaporean to reflect whether the absolute powers of the ISA have been previously used to safeguard the security of Singapore or only to maintain PAP's stranglehold on political power. During the detentions, I admired Soh Lung for her determination to pursue justice through the Singapore courts. Whilst the PAP government had no compunction in using the ISA and destroying the rule of law, Soh Lung was the very opposite. By pursuing justice through Singapore courts, she affirmed her commitment to protect the rule of law in Singapore and never ceased in having faith that one day justice would prevail. Soh Lung, by her actions, is indeed a true Singaporean committed to building a democratic society based on justice and equality. Kevin D'Souza, okay, that's from Kevin D'Souza. The next message is from Lord Anthony Lester, Lord Lester of Herne Hill, QC. He was Soh Lung's lawyer. It is my great privilege to have acted as leading counsel in the Singapore courts, seeking Teo Soh Lung's release from her arbitrary detention without trial. It was one of the most memorable experiences of my professional life. Like my friend and colleague, the late Lord Alexander QC, who took my place when I was banned from representing her again, I failed to secure her freedom from her long period of solitary confinement as a prisoner of conscience. And she suffered greatly for her defense of the freedom of the press and the independence of the legal profession. Soh Lung is a woman of outstanding integrity and remarkable courage. Her book deserves to be read by everyone who cares for free speech and justice under the rule of law. It is an inspiring testament to liberty and a warning against public indifference to attacks upon civil and political rights. That is from Lord Anthony Lester. The next one is from Francis Khoo, who is a former lawyer and now in exile. Teo Soh Lung belongs to the increasingly rare breed of lawyers who believe in social justice and human rights. For that, she paid the price of her commitment by being imprisoned without trial under the Internal Security Act. The ISA is a most pernicious piece of legislation which has no place in modern Singapore. Her book will give us a glimpse of her campaign against the Act and her fight for freedom. I do hope a new generation of Singaporeans will read and be inspired by her courage and take up the challenge to see the eventual abolition of the Act. I would have loved to be present at this book launch, but given my state of exile from the country of my birth, I must send my sincere apologies. My deepest congratulations to a heroine of Singapore. Next one, by Francis Xiao, who is the former Solicitor General, and he writes in really good English. The very first word is called an exordium, and I was wondering, now what is that? And it means an opening section to something or other, to this. Okay, so I'll try to read it, make it as easy to understand as possible. Not that difficult, really. Okay, May 21, 1987 will forever remain Singapore's own day of infamy. The day when Lee Kuan Yew, then Prime Minister, using the guise of internal security, abused its executive powers by ordering the arrest and detention of 22 innocent men and women who were associated with the Roman Catholic Church and allied social activities. Amongst them was Miss Teo Soh Lung, a young lawyer with a keen sense of social justice, who, Lee claims, was a dangerous Marxist. Given Lee Kuan Yew's style of governance, the Internal Security Department, the so-called guardian of the security of the nation, was virtually overruled by him, as the PAP cabinet of ministers was similarly ignored and left in a similar state of ignorance and shock as it did the nation. On this infamous day, 22 young Roman Catholic Church and social activists were accused of plotting the violent overthrow of Lee and his PAP government through force of arms and replacing it with a Marxist state, which only their timely arrests under the notorious Internal Security Act had thwarted. Given that communism worldwide was passé, a cruel new twist was given to these arrests, in that they were accused of being Marxists or Marxist inclined. In brief, they were accused of trying to subvert Lee and his PAP government through violence and replacing it with a Marxist government. Not a single round of ammunition or any weapon was ever produced to substantiate this allegation. A more ludicrous allegation is hard to come by. Even so, I acted as legal counsel to Ms. Teo Soh Lung, who was arrested and detained with several others on those preposterous grounds. In the course of my professional visits to her at the infamous Whitley Road Centre, I suddenly found myself arrested and detained under the same Internal Security Act. No reasons were given for my arrest and detention. In the result, I could not see my client, Ms. Teo Soh Lung, that day. This was Lee Kuan Yew's tortured thinking, and he, of course, is never wrong. It also marks the overriding powers of one man over his cabinet colleagues, all of whom are in mortal dread of him. It was, however, later alleged that I was an agent of the US Central Intelligence Agency, from which I allegedly received payments of vast sums of money. After my release from detention, I was in the United States of America as a visiting fellow at Yale University, and later at Harvard University, from where I gave numerous presentations and at other US institutions of learning, at all of which I tried to pass word that, contrary to Lee Kuan Yew's wild and morbid accusations, I have yet to receive payments from the CIA, in the hope that it would reach the right ears of the fates that have befallen me, so that I can at least receive from the CIA belated payments. To this day, I have not heard from the CIA. And so, Ms. Teo Soh Lung was not a Marxist, nor I, a paid CIA agent. Francis Yao. Okay, the next one is from Tang Phong Ha, who is also an ISA detainee and now in exile after signing a statement claiming her innocence. Okay, dear Soh Lung, I regret that I cannot be here with you today, but I'm so proud that you have written about your experience behind the Blue Gate. This book will show Singaporeans how an authoritarian government made use of the Internal Security Act to suppress and oppress dissenting voices. The draconian and archaic ISA was put into place by our colonial masters, the British, to oppress the natives, and it has no place in modern Singapore society. If your book acts as a catalyst towards the abolition of the ISA, then you have contributed to a more democratic and a more humane Singapore. Tang Phong Ha. Just a few more. This is from Ko Ku, who is also a former ISA detainee. By electing to share her experience of her 2.5 years as a political prisoner with a wider audience, Teo Soh Lung has spoken out on behalf of many of her compatriots who suffered a similar trauma, but chose to remain silent witnesses for a variety of reasons. Though armed conflicts never engulfed Singapore, post-war Singapore, it is estimated that a few thousand men and women of various backgrounds were incarcerated without due process by the state from the early 50s to the late 80s as part of its pacification program to keep its residents and citizens at bay. Many personal lives were destroyed besides the anguish, mental and physical, suffered by their loved ones. This human tragedy represents the lesser-known social costs of Singapore's modernization and is only now beginning to be told. As we approach the second half-century of statehood, it is timely to call for the abolition of the ISA and its consignment to the rubbish heap of history. Ko Ku. This next one, the penultimate one, is by Margaret John, Coordinator for Singapore and Malaysia, Amnesty International Canada. Dear Soh Lung, the arrests of 1987 marked a distinct heightening in international awareness and concern about the state of human rights in Singapore. I well remember many inquiries I, as an Amnesty International member in Canada, received, and the immediate increase in campaigning on Singapore. It was a bleak time indeed for human rights. But in the following years, after their release, there was widespread sympathy for the former prisoners of conscience, who mostly remained silent, apart from those who were able to go into exile. Now, in recent years, we have welcomed the forceful accounts of a number of those former prisoners who still live in Singapore. Those accounts are vital to the true record of Singapore's history. Soh Lung, you were at the very center of that group of young professionals who were arrested following the involvement in social justice issues. Your book will be essential to the telling of that shameful era, an era that is not yet fully past. Margaret John. And the last one is from Tinika E. Jansen, who is a friend from Europe who campaigned for Soh Lung and all the other detainees' arrests during the 1987 and the years thereafter. It comes in a kind of a poem. Dear Soh Lung, for weeks already, you are on my mind. I see your face, your eyes again, when looking at me, slightly up. At your side, I'm so much taller than back home. Slightly up, with a smile, a bit mischievous maybe, while a tear should disappear. I will be near. Laugh, no fear. Tinika E. Jensen. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for sitting down. We are going to start with the question and answer session. With me today, in addition to Teo Soh Lung, we also have the other former detainees of the 1987 Operation Spectrum. Okay, I'll just do a brief introduction. Starting from my left is Mr. William Yap. William was one of the 6 UK returnees who were detained in 1987. He was studying in Chng High School before he went to London. He was a student activist during the 70s in London before he came back to Singapore in the early 80s. He took part in Third Stage, which is a theatre company, for a short period of time during which he came to know ex-USSU members. Ironically, he didn't know many of the so-called Marxist conspirators before Operation Spectrum, but they have now become some of his best friends. So give a hand for Mr. William. Gentleman directly to my left is Mr. Vincent Cheng, who I think made the headlines recently. Full brush with the National Library. Mr. Vincent Cheng, at the time of his arrest, Vincent Cheng was the Executive Secretary of the Justice and Peace Commission of the Roman Catholic Church. He trained to be a Catholic priest for 9 years, but finally refused to be ordained and opted to be a social worker. Trained in community organization methodology, he had been mainly working with migrant workers. Vincent was also interested in promoting consciousness-raising social analysis. Okay, a hand for Mr. Ms. Teo Soh Lung doesn't need an introduction, so we'll move on to Ms. Wong Suk Yi. Wong Suk Yi was in the Executive Committee of the University of Singapore Students' Union, USSU, in the late 1970s. After her studies, she formed the theatre group Third Stage in 1983 with William Yap and 8 other friends. At the time of her arrest, she had written, directed, and acted in a few of Third Stage productions. So, pioneer in Singapore theatre. Okay, so what we're gonna do now is we're just gonna immediately open it up to the floor.
Okay, I'm afraid this is sort of a general question. Are any of you in touch with what's happening with current ISA detainees? I mean, they're the ones who are being arrested in the war on terror, as it were.
Anyone in touch? Okay, foreheads shaking. So I guess that answers your question.
Why did he ask that question? Because for some relation, so maybe you can clarify that as well.
I suppose it's in. I've been thinking about the way, especially in Mr. Vincent Cheng's recent, brush with the National Library Board, how 1987 and the trauma of ISA is being categorized in terms of history, when the ISA is not yet over, and how much more difficult it is to deal with the fact that we are, the idea of terrorism today is much more real, and yet the ISA is still unjust. I mean, you guys are, you guys are heroes much more obviously than someone who's being arrested for the ISA under suspicions of terrorism today. I guess I wanted to deal with that how do we not historicize this?
If I would just take something from there, I suppose maybe I'll just ask this general question. Given the current security climate, are we dealing with a different kind of ISA than the one that was used, let's say, in 63 and 87? Can there possibly be a kind of justification for the ISA currently? And of course, maybe related to that is,
is it a rehabilitated ISA that we are currently using right now?
Actually, I don't know. From the fact actually that we have got no direct information from the present group of ISA detainees, I feel actually worried what is really happening, because we really have got no information from them directly. I just hope that in 20 years' time, they will not come out and say the same thing like us now today.
Anything to share from this side? Do you think it's a different kind of ISA, or yeah?
Like Vincent, I'm actually very bothered about people who are arrested today under the ISA. And so little information we get about them. I did try to find out where they are and what they did, but I have no clue why they are being detained. All we hear is that they are terrorists, but are they? I really have my grave doubts. Thank you.
Thank you. Any question? Yes, please.
Hi, Betty Koo. I just wanted on this point, the ones who are presently detained, would they all be Muslims?
Yeah, I suppose to continue a current theme right now, we don't know, right? We're still very much in the dark. And I think again, it's that whole question of, okay, they're not tried in an open court, they're not being given due process, they're not convicted really, they're in this current state of limbo, where, which is, okay, you are prosecuted or are you not? Are you just only being interrogated? What kind of interrogation is it? Is there not a kind of deadline for these things? Indefinite 2-year extensions of the detention order. So yeah, I think that there might be other ways, to deal with terrorists, and I'm quite, or even proto-terrorists, because in a sense, no crime has actually being committed. It is preemptive in a way. So I think we don't know, but I would suppose the majority of them are. I don't know whether anyone might have a bit more information that you might like to share.
It brings to mind, in 1987, there were 4 Muslim so-called fundamentalists in 87, but actually very few people know about them except from the brief reports in the newspapers. What I want to say is that the 1987 people were, the 22 of us were actually very fortunate in that we have many friends from all over the world who believed that we were innocent and campaigned for us. Unfortunately for the 4 Muslim so-called fundamentalists, nobody knew about them. In fact, while checking about them, I heard that the government actually accused them of having weapons. And then I heard that, well, actually it was not weapon, it was those ceremonial swords that some Muslims would display on the wall in their homes. So really, it is very unfortunate that we do not know anything about their side of the story. I hope that one day they will write about their story.
Thank you. Alex?
This is a double-headed monster of a question. I'm so sorry. But it's entirely Rizal's fault for prompting a second question when I had my first prepared. But let me deal with the first question. Are we here talking about your objection to ISA or to detention without trial? Because we have another piece of legislation, I think it's called temporary provisions, which also allows for detention without trial. And we know that people have been detained. We we hear even, I mean, congratulations to all of you for being upfront about your experiences. I think we're all better off that you're speaking up. But we hear nothing about those who have been detained under the penal law temporary provisions either. So I just wanted to be clear in my mind, are we talking here about ISA only or about detention without trial? And what are your positions on that other piece of legislation? The other question that Rizal prompted me to ask is, how have your families been affected by 1987 and its aftermath?
Family. Okay, the difference is that of the people that are sitting here, I suppose I'm the only one from the Chinese stream. So my experience is quite different from, I suppose, those of some of them. So in the case of, okay, I'll talk about the family response. When it took place in 1987, I was staying with my mom, and obviously it was taken by surprise. And when the ISD officers came in, and we thought what happened. Actually, at that time, I was quite active in London, I say, because when I went to that part of the world, and the Vietnam War and so on, and there were demonstrations and so on. And I was quite affected by that kind of campaign and movement. And of course, coming from my background, anyway, one of the senior ISD officers said, William Yap, his family is as red as the Goa. That speaks liver, I don't know what it really means. That is the kind of background. And coming, anyway, by the time when the rest took place, I had been back for a few years, and actually I wasn't so active anymore. And when that took place, my family members were really taken aback, taken by surprise. And anyway, I did have to face it. I had to face it. And as I said, as an introduction said, at that time I didn't know actually many of our friends here. Of course, the 6 of us who came back from the UK, who were detained, of course we knew each other. We were playing badminton together and so on. And one of them was Taman. One of them was Taman. And Lam Kyong was there too. Those of you who know, I think Lam Kyong was there, yes. So, yes, generally the family response was not so good. Even today, when I said that I'm going to be on a panel, I said, be careful. You better know where your rice bowl is. Okay, that's the kind of attitude anyway, but well, our understanding is that if there's a problem in society, then we have to face it, and we have to try to solve it. And that is why I'm here. Thank you.
When I was arrested actually in 87 at 5 a.m., 2 ISD officers came to the gate of our flat, and my father opened the door and happened to recognize one of them. My father actually worked in the registry of companies, and as the assistant registrar, he knew some of the ISD officers. So one of them actually who came to arrest me is known to him. So he told my father, I just want to speak to Vincent. My father said at this early hour in the morning, said, oh, don't worry, just to speak to him. So my father opened the door. So when the door was opened, immediately the two of them rushed in, and then followed by 6 others who were hiding in the corridors. And they rushed in, and they pushed my parents aside, and then they came straight for my bedroom. So I woke up, and thereupon I found that they were going to arrest me without any warrant. Straight away, they separated me from my parents, and that actually frightened both my parents and me, because I wanted to speak to my parents and at least comfort them or give them some assurance actually of what is happening. But they disallowed throughout that whole 1.5 hours, I think, that they were in my house, ransacking my room. And they even came with a photographer. So that first experience actually caused my parents, especially my mother, tremendous trauma. When I was actually in prison for 3 years, I would hear my family members saying that whenever there is a knock on the door, she would be so frightened that she would burst into tears. My father, on the other hand, actually is a more stubborn character. He was really angry, and I think even to this day, he is still very angry that his son actually has been arrested actually by the ISD, whom he had been very helpful actually whenever they came to the registry of companies for help. And among my other siblings, they do complain to me of having been watched, even indirectly threatened. In fact, one of my younger brothers had a legal case, a civil case, and then he was brought to chambers. And in chambers, before I think the registrar and the other party told the judge, do you know who his brother is? No? His brother was one of those Marxist conspirators. And even then, the judge actually kept quiet about it. So these are the kind of things actually that they will make use of actually even later on.
Maybe I just answer very briefly Alex's first question about whether we are talking about ISA or detention without trial. I suppose personally we are talking about all detentions that deny a detainee a free and fair trial. I mean, whether it was then in '87 or now, days of terrorism. I mean, we talk about evidence-based research, evidence-based policy. I mean, when it comes to the freedom and the life of a person, I think all the more the person deserves a fair trial where evidence is produced against him or her before a judgment is made. Yeah. Well, my family, very briefly. Well, I have a brother who worked for the naval SAF as a naval officer all his life. It's to be expected that we have different worldviews, and I'm not sure if he actually thought that I was guilty of the crime alleged by the government. but I'm sure he thinks that 15 months of detention will do me a whole lot of good. The positive outcome of the detention, still relating to your question, is I made a lot of friends. Friends for life. Of course, I lost a few friends too.
To Alex's first question, of course I oppose detention without trial, whether it be ISA or the Criminal Law Temporary Provisions Act. In fact, I have appeared before the board for two of my clients when they were detained under the Criminal Law Temporary Provisions Act, and I know what it is all about. It is exactly like the ISA advisory board. It's quite toothless. As far as my family is concerned, they were fully behind me because I was not such a bad person as they believed me. So I have no problem whatsoever with all members of my family.
Thank you so much for all that sharing.
Actually, this question takes off from Alfian's introductory remarks when he mentioned about So Lung's studying of the jailers and trying to put herself in their position. I think the same process took place in Nelson Mandela's time when he was in jail for 27 years. He also studied his jailers. So after studying them for a very, very long time, he concluded that they are also human. The difference is that I think he managed to talk to President Botha and President de Klerk. So there were negotiations even before he was set free. My next point is that how is it possible to establish a Truth and Justice Commission? In the same sense that Mandela was able to persuade or establish a dialogue with the powers that be, and together they set South Africa on a new road. So perhaps with the writing of so many books, Beyond the Blue Gate, Fajar Generation, perhaps this might lead to the laying of the groundwork, and especially with many new political parties being formed. Perhaps that is the basis of starting a dialogue which will bring us into the future and into the abolition of the ISA. Any comments from the panel?
So Lung was praised in the messages we read for her dedication to the process of law, due process. You're a lawyer, so is Mr. Mentor, was, is. How can you still believe in the process, the due process, after what you've gone through? And did you not think it was a futile exercise in your part to apply for habeas corpus? And how do you feel now?
Okay, I think some of those answers might be inside the book, but we'll let So Lung answer that anyway. We'll have the last question.
I'm Russell Hay. Quick question is, from what I've read over the years, the restrictions of the ISA doesn't just end on the day when the detainee is released, that there continues some sort of restrictions. So my question is, of you sitting there, and you say have certain restrictions that you have to abide by the day, and tag on to that question, just as you understand. I may be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but all four of you don't have a profile anymore in civil society in Singapore. Is it because you have moved on, or you are still kind of wary, or some of these restrictions are there bothering you and restricting you? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll just summarize a little bit. There was one question about potentially a Truth and Justice Commission being set up in the future. Any comments on that? Personal question to Soh Lung, how do you still believe in the rule of law after what you've been through? And lastly, are there still restriction orders on what you can or cannot do in public? Okay, Soh Lung.
I think none of us have any more restriction orders for many, many years. Regarding Peter Lim's question, I think you can find the answer in the book. I shan't tell you what I feel here, right? What was that's all right. It's good that Patrick Low raised this question. Why not? We are a first world nation. Nobody is taking up arms. Why can't we have a truth and reconciliation process going on? And sure, there is every possibility, and it should happen. I'm still optimistic.
Well, okay, yeah. Technically, there are no restrictions on any one of us, but I think as long as we live in Singapore, there will always be implicit and explicit restrictions. Vincent's case is a good case in point.
When I was released actually in 1990, I was given actually 6 restrictive conditions. They were so severe, it was almost like being imprisoned in my own house. It came to the extent when I could not even speak to anybody, because they told me one of the conditions was I could not communicate with any member of any organization implicated in the Marxist conspiracy. That includes the church, no? So I was not even allowed to speak to the Archbishop to tell him about my case. So when I raised this point to the ISD, they told me, yeah, Vincent, what for? Forget about it, let things let go, and then, you will become better. So that's the kind of thing. So the restrictions actually were very heavy, and I thought, okay, since you want to pressure me like that, then I will obey the conditions to the letter. So that even after 2 years, they released one condition, and that was I could not leave the country. So they told me, Vincent, you can leave the country now, no? You can go for a holiday. All your friends have all gone for a holiday. But don't go to Hong Kong, don't go to Australia. Your friends are there. You can go to Lake Toba. But I refuse even to go out at all. Because if they want to punish you so severely, then let it be. Let it be.
Okay, so sorry we have to wrap up. I wish this could go on for a while. A lot of very interesting things are being discussed. I'm especially intrigued by the idea of what is the way forward, what is the future. I'm all for the idea of a Truth and Justice and Reconciliation Commission, but of course, many questions. Who are the people who should be brought to justice? Right? Should there be any kind of compensation or reparation for what we've been through? Do we have to wait for people to die before these things can take effect? But I think, I suppose the good thing is that we at least have time on our side. Who would have thought, that this book would actually see the light of day, honestly, around that time, 2 decades back, and I'm so happy. It gives me so much hope that this society is changing for the better. So thank you very much.
good news. Now you can have your tea. And buy books, help me to defray some costs.